News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Ed Kalegi. House Republicans announced a spending bill to keep government agencies open through September 30th, daring Democrats to vote against it and risk a disruptive March 15th shutdown. The move tees up a dramatic confrontation on Capitol Hill next week and threatens to further fuel uncertainty for a federal workforce roiled by swift and aggressive cuts made by billionaire Elon Musk. Speaker Mike Johnson will attempt to hold the fractious Republican majority together and muscle the 100-page bill through the House on Tuesday, likely without help from Democrats. But the bill would still need the help of moderate Democrats in the Senate, where the legislation would stall without 60 votes. Officials say Russia launched heavy aerial attacks on Ukraine for a second night Saturday after the United States stopped sharing satellite images with the Ukrainian government. At least 22 people have been killed. The U.S. decision to withhold intelligence and military aid came on the heels of a tempestuous White House visit last week by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The U.S. has rejected a Canadian proposal to establish a task force that would tackle Russia's so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers, as the Trump administration reevaluates its positions across multilateral organizations. This according to people familiar with the matter. Canada, which holds this year's revolving G7 presidency, will hold a summit of foreign ministers in Quebec next week. In negotiations to formulate a joint statement on maritime issues, the U.S. is pushing to strengthen language around China while watering down wording on Russia. This according to the people who asked not to be identified, discussing sensitive matters that are not public. Germany's conservatives and the Social Democrats agreed to deepen talks over forming a new government, a step forward as pressure builds on Chancellor-in-waiting Friedrich Merz to implement sweeping reforms. At a press briefing in Berlin on Saturday, Merz said the parties have agreed to tighten border controls to reduce illegal immigration, as well as implement reforms aimed at supporting German industry, including lowering energy costs and corporate taxes. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said he rejects a U.S. push for talks between the two countries because they would be aimed at imposing restrictions on Iranian missile range and its influence in the region. Speaking to a group of officials on Saturday, Khamenei did not identify the United States by name, but said a bullying government was being persistent in its push for talks. Russia's population is declining at its quickest pace since the COVID-19 pandemic. Bloomberg's Karen Moskow tells us it comes as President Vladimir Putin declared that a demographic turnaround is the country's most important priority.
Russia recorded the lowest number of births last year in a quarter of a century, while the number of deaths increased for the first time since the height of the pandemic. The pace of the population decline accelerated by roughly 20% compared to 2023. Among the reasons for the decline, the country's three-year war with Ukraine and fewer women of childbearing age. And that could put a strain on Russia's economy, which is already starved for labor and could put security at risk as well. Not to mention a graying population is harder to support economically with a shrinking workforce. Karen Moskow, Bloomberg Radio.
Another down week for Tesla shares, a week in which its shares briefly returned to where they closed on November 5th. We get more on this from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellett.
In the weeks after Donald Trump won the presidential election, investors pumped more than $700 billion into Tesla shares, betting that Elon Musk's relationship with the commander-in-chief and growing political prominence would pay off for the automaker. Barely 4 months later, that wager is shaping up to be one of the biggest studs of the equity market. Tesla was initially one of the biggest winners after Election Day, but it just had a record 7th straight week of losses. In New York, Charlie Pellett, Bloomberg Radio.
Third-round action at the Arnold Palmer Invitational at Bay Hill near Orlando. At last check, Shane Lowry maintains a 2-shot lead. The act of putting something aside is an exercise in remembering what we lose when our memories exist entirely in our phones. You can read all about it in Bloomberg's Weekend Edition, exploring the places where finance, life, and culture meet. Find it now on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. That's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Ed Kalegi. This is Bloomberg.